Here's the new book, Cross Purposes, Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. Okay, I have to tell you, well, first of all, it's a great book. All your writings are so good. And thank you for writing a slim book. Thank God. It seems to be the trend. I'm never again gonna write a 500-page book. It seems to be not the
it
way
wasn't my
anymore.
fault. The publisher says this is going to be in a series, and I couldn't go over 40,000 words. So I came in at 40,000 before the bibliographical note.
I see. Right. Trimmed it down. One of my techniques is when I hate giving it something up is just tell myself, I will use that in the next book. And then I'm like, okay, so go ahead and cut it. You don't feel like you're throwing it away. But okay, so Jonathan, you're one of my favorite atheist writers. Here you are writing a book in essence defending religion in general and Christianity in particular. What happened to you or to religion or to the society or whatever?
So I maybe like you, I'm a lifelong atheist. I tried to believe at one point in my adolescence, and I'm just not wired that way. And religion, the idea of supernatural beings and people that are shaped like a big daddy in the sky, which performs miracles and organizes this entire vast, vast cosmos around the needs of one tiny little primate species. It just never made any sense to me. And I'm particularly eager to be on this show because I am trying to talk to my own former self. And my own former self was someone who in 2003 wrote an article for The Atlantic, which I call the dumbest thing I ever wrote. And that includes my 2015 article for The Atlantic, confidently predicting that Donald Trump would never be president. So this is worse. In 2003, I celebrated what I called apatheism, which is rise of apathy about religion, meaning secularism, that people weren't caring about God or religion one way or the other. They weren't even bothering to be atheists. They were just losing interest. And I thought, well, that's great. We'll be like Scandinavia and we'll be more enlightened and more rational because religion is a force for superstition and dogma and division and often cruelty. And so isn't this a great thing? A civilizational advance, I call it. And that makes me cringe in hindsight because what I didn't know, Michael, was that I was about to get my wish that we've seen in the last 15 to 20 years, just very recently, what amounts to a collapse of Christianity in America, a wave of secularization on a scale we've never seen before. And the focus of it, the center, is not the mainline Protestant churches that began fading in the last century. It's the conservative white evangelical churches. So what I didn't understand about that is that a lot of people, maybe not you and maybe not me, but a lot of people look to religion to get a transcendent sense of why they're here on the planet and where good and evil come from. And religion has answers to those questions, which I candidly do not. I can't really give anyone a satisfying answer to those. And as Christianity receded, people looked to substitute pseudo-religions. And some of those are benign but ineffective, like Soul Cycle or Wicca. They give people some of the gestures of religion without the big theological and moral frameworks that the big organized religions can convey. And then others were just outright toxic, and pseudo-religions that are politicized, divisive, polarizing, and those are things like QAnon. And I think wokeness has some aspects of religion. And I think the MAGA movement has aspects of religion. These were giving people identities, but they were divisive and antagonistic identities that relied on partisan politics. So it turns out that the way things actually went is the decline of Christianity has made America harder to govern. And that's why I thought I had to write this book.
Do you want to say a word about your friend Mark, who you opened the book with and closed the book with in a very thoughtful, meaningful way, I thought?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, though sometimes I can't get through this without choking up a little bit. All right. So I was someone, as a teenager, I was very angry about Christianity. I knew from an early age that I was different in a fundamental way. Eventually, I would understand that meant that I was attracted to men, that I was gay. I didn't know that, but I knew I was different. And I knew that there was no room in the church for me. You couldn't turn a radio dial in your car on a Sunday morning in the 60s and 70s without hearing that homosexuals are a stench in God's nostrils and that they're going to hell and taking other people with us and recruiting children. And I believe that Christianity was basically about cruelty and hypocrisy. And that began to change when I was paired with a roommate in college named Mark McIntosh, who was my first exposure to a Christian who talked the talk and also walked the walk. He was, he was not a plaster saint. He had a temper and sense of humor, but he took his Christianity seriously. He was a very devout member of the Episcopal Church. And seeing him, I began to realize that there were Christians who took the gospel seriously, took it to heart, and let it shape their lives. And that set me out on a journey which continues to this day of trying to understand the Christian faith a little better, not seeing it just as ignorant or superstitious. I still don't believe in God. I don't think I can or will, and I don't particularly want to. But I have come to see some very significant and important truths in Christian teachings. And I have seen that Christianity can shape people and society for the better. And I owe that journey, I think, to Mark more than anyone else. I co-dedicated the book to him and Pastor Tim Keller, both of whom we lost in the last couple of years.
Mm-hmm. So he was an Episcopal. If I recall, the Episcopal Church was on the leading edge of being more accepting of same-sex marriage, or at least gay relationships, than other branches of Christianity.
Yes, and they hit some real heavy weather as a result of that. Mark was a very conservative person in the political sense, but he was also, I remember there was a petition at Yale for gay rights when we were there, and he was one of the first to sign it because he did not believe that God wanted to judge him, to judge. He did not believe that God wanted him to be the judge of others, of gay people and homosexuals.
Mm. Right. So I think there's a couple moving parts here. First, you show the rise of the nuns pretty definitively. There doesn't seem to be much doubt about those statistics, right? From multiple sources, replicated by many different polling agencies and so on. So there's no doubt about that. But simultaneously, there's also been this rise of polarization politically, which you've tracked and followed for decades. And so I guess one question is, are those related? And which branches of Christianity are kind of fueling the polarization? And then maybe reflect on that in perspective of the rise of the religious right in the 80s, in the 90s, say, with Reagan and the moral majority and all that. This seems different from that movement.
All of the above. That's so. So how long do you have? There's a lot to.
Go ahead. Yeah, no, I love
to.
You know a lot about this, so
to unpack there. So I'll start maybe, if you agree, by mentioning just a couple of typical statistics to give people an idea of the scale of what's happening. It's totally without precedent in American life. Some people call this the Great De-Churching. In the 14 years between 2008 and 2022, the number of Americans who never attend a religious service almost doubled from 45 million people to 85 million. And that is more people leaving religion than came in during all three of the Great Awakenings. Church membership was 70%, 70%, hovered around there for the whole 20th century, from the beginning of polling in the 40s through the turn of the century. In the 20 years between 2000 and 2020, that dropped to 47%. That's more than a percentage point a year, too. So now a minority of Americans are members of a church, synagogue, or mosque, but that's overwhelmingly a decline in Christianity. The share of, you mentioned the nuns, the share of the percentage of population who identify as Christian was 78% in 2007, and only 14 years later, it was 63%, dropping a percentage point every year. And in terms of big social trends, Michael, almost nothing drops a percentage point a year, year after year. And where are those people going? They are going to no religion, the nuns, N-O-N-E-S. So this is a fundamental change in the complexion of our society. It's a social experiment on a massive scale. So you asked about that, and I think, was it polarization?
Yeah.
So there's an indirect effect and there's a direct effect. The indirect effect is what I alluded to earlier. When people leave Christianity and become a nun, they don't necessarily lose the desire to have a meaning in life, a source of identity, a source of community. Most people need those things. And so they turn to other kinds of belief. And as I alluded to earlier, none of those is remotely as well thought through and as good at laying down a moral foundation for people and acculturating people, socializing people into a moral foundation as the great religions. That's in America. That's, of course, predominantly Christianity. So, something like Soul Cycle may give you a sense of community and in some way a sense of purpose, but it can't approach the theological depth of religion or the teachings of, for example, Jesus or Paul. And then a lot of the substitutes are just downright toxic. This is people getting their identity and their purpose in life from being a radical, polarized partisan, identifying as a crusading left-winger. This is what gives wokeness that strange quality that you and I have, I think, talked about, this kind of crusading, apocalyptic mentality, often completely at odds with reality. You could argue the same about MAGA. So that's the indirect effect. The direct effect has been the politicization of white Protestantism, the evangelical movement. So as it's shrunk, it has become more secularized. It has become more partisan, more political. It has in many ways merged with the Republican Party. And that's driving a lot of people away who don't want to do that, which is one of the reasons it's shrinking, while making the church itself a more and more partisan, radical, and divisive force in society. So it's having that effect inside the church. There's this weird phenomenon, and this is kind of new, and it's quite strange, of evangelicals who never go to church. That used to be, a few years ago, that was a vanishingly small number. Now it's like 1 in 8. So these are people coming into the church not because they identify with the gospel of Jesus Christ, but because, frankly, they identify with the gospel of Donald Trump, the Republican Party, and the MAGA movement. And so for them, evangelical is a political label. And that's changing the complexion of the church itself. So all of those things mean that the church has a harder and harder time doing the function that the founding fathers relied on it to do, which is acculturating us into the civic virtues. I know that I put a lot on the table there, so forgive me.
Well, that's okay. Yeah, just go ahead and we can unpack some of that on the founding fathers, starting there. Is the argument something like to have a self-governing people and a smallish government, and we don't have the long arm of the law to reach out to these outskirt communities, these self-governing people need to have an internal moral compass, a sense of right and wrong and virtue, sort of Aristotelian virtue ethics of some sort or another. And religion in the 18th century, that was the only source. The inculcating of Enlightenment values into, civil rights movement in the 1960s, we were centuries away from that. So is that something like how you interpret the founding fathers thinking about religion?
I'd tweak that a bit. The founding fathers did not believe that you had to be a Christian to be a good America, and they very deliberately separated church from state. So we did not have a Christian government. Christians at the time were very unhappy the Constitution did not mention Jesus Christ. They thought it should. And I think the founders got that right. But they told us, all of them, Hamilton, Washington, Madison, Adams, Franklin, they all told us that the Constitution gives us a process for self-government. But they warned us that this process relies on what they called Republican virtues. And that means things like being law-abiding, being truthful, being civil to each other, being willing to lose an election but stay part of the system. And they understood that those things had to be brought into the system by civil society. They didn't say that was only religion. There are other sources. There's family, and there's civic groups, which were important then and are important now. But yeah, they thought that Christianity had to play a role in socializing people into Republican virtues. They saw that these things had to work together, and they warned us that if we stopped cultivating these Republican virtues, that nothing could save our democratic system from collapse. So here we are, and their prophecy is being tested right now.
Yeah. Okay, a couple things. Jerry Coyne's term fatheism, in which he's critical of atheists who say, yeah, I don't believe in God, I don't need religion, but the little people need it. So we have to kind of let them have that. That's not what you're doing here.
Well, I hope it's not what I'm doing. So here's a part of the book where I would love to get your opinion, because I think a lot of atheists will feel that I kind of abandon our side here. And maybe they're right. Yesterday I taped a podcast with an atheist guy who said, aren't you kind of throwing in the towel here and giving up on a secular society that can really function in a democracy? And I said, yeah, I guess in a sense I am. But so I am not saying I can't be a Christian, but I'm glad those other dumber people can.
Right.
I'm saying the opposite of that. Here's where I thought I might get in trouble with you. So I'm saying that neither the scientific materialist worldview, which is basically where I'm coming from, nor the faith-based worldview is complete in and of itself, because they're existential questions, profound questions that only one or the other can answer. So you need them both. And I say that the two core questions that my worldview has grappled with, but has never succeeded in answering in a satisfying way, are number one, the question of mortality. Why are we here? Is there any larger meaning to our lives than just being a clump of cells that appeared one briefly and then disappear? That's a profoundly unsatisfying vision to most people. And the other is morality, which is, what's the difference between right and wrong that transcends just personal preference? This is Nietzsche's great challenge. He says, he doesn't like Christianity, but he realizes without it, people won't have an anchor for right and wrong. They'll have to invent their own morality. And as we know, that doesn't turn out too well. But then on the other hand, the religious side cannot provide two things that my side, the skeptical scientific side, can. And one is a coherent account of the universe that explains the world in a way that does not require random supernatural acts, which make a nonsense of any coherent explanation. And the second thing that religion can't provide is an answer to the problem of evil. Why would a good God allow, childhood leukemia, smallpox, the tsunami that killed, hundreds of thousands of people, seemingly randomly and cruelly? No religion has been able really to cope with that, at least none of the monotheistic ones. And the pastors I talk to are kind of honest about that, some of them. And so at this deep fundamental level, I think society, and many humans are only comfortable in a world where science and faith can coexist. Because that's a world where there are access to both kinds of answers. And this is where I thought I might get in trouble with, someone whose bookshelf says the Skeptic right behind it. I'm kind of claiming that we fall short in these two crucial dimensions, and that we need the help of faith to create a complete worldview.
Yeah. Okay, let me kind of riff on that a little bit. I think so. Your four elements there, your four M's: mortality, morality, murder, miracles, that you just kind of reviewed there. So let's go through those. So first of all, I guess if religions are not making empirical claims, but just like social benefit claims, then I'm okay with that. Like, one of the things that religion does well is it mans the soup kitchens. It helps people that need help. The Mormon Church, who you talk about a lot in your book, they're great about this. I mean, the whole tithing program. I know a lot of Mormons. These are really good people, and they really do make society better, especially in Utah. I mean, they take care of each other, right? I mean, that's the kind of social gospel that I've always respected. The prosperity gospel, God wants me to be rich, not so much. But so I think religion's done well on that. The studies showing that religious people give more money, they donate more blood, they donate more time, they live longer, they're healthier. You don't need any supernatural element to explain that. You can go to Putnam's Bowling Alone book and say, yeah, I mean, civic virtues and organizations that get people together where you have a social capital and people help each other. And religion's good at that. There's secular versions of this, but religion has had a long head start on that, and they do it pretty well. So when someone like Ayaan Hirsi Ali says, I'm now a Christian, and initially she said because at least they know what a woman is, and they can stand up to the misogynistic Islamists who do these horrible things to women. But then she kind of shifted from that, more of a sort of a practical benefits of religion, to, and I now accept Jesus as my savior. And and then when pressed on that, she says, not mythically or metaphorically rose from the dead, but literally, right? So this is kind of where the rubber meets the road. If you want to go full Jordan Peterson, Joseph Campbell, the resurrection is a literary story with a deeper kind of psychological truth about human nature and forgiveness and starting over. Okay, fine. Why would I ask if the brothers Karamazov ever really existed? That'd be an idiotic question. The story of the novel is the truth behind it. But when I run this past Christians, they're like, no. There was really a guy named Jesus. He really died. He was dead for 3 days, not in a coma. He didn't pass out and was in this cold cave, and then they brought him back, and he went off to France and married Mary Magdalene, go full Dan Brown. Or that there was that book, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, in the 70s. That it was not a novel. It was like, this really happened. Anyway, but they're not buying that. It seems to me that Christians seem to think that these have to be literal, empirical truths. And for me, that's where I get off the train there. It's the difference between literary, mythical, metaphorical truths versus literal. Anyway, that's my first thought on that.
Should I come in now, or is there more where that came from?
Yeah.
So I think one of the reasons I'm not a person who says, well, I don't believe, but I'm glad other people do, is that I think the only good reason to believe in a religion is because you think it's true, not because you think it'll help you in society or it's a good way to meet people and get dates.
Right.
And that's always been the obstacle for me, as it has been for you, that I don't believe that it is even theoretically possible that the molecules of a human's body could defy the second law of thermodynamics. The decomposition of the body begins in minutes after death. All those amino acids and everything, they start to fall apart. And running that process backwards would mean totally revising all the known laws of the universe and making a nonsense of everything we know. And I'm, as a methodological matter, as an epistemological matter, not just empirically, I am unwilling to throw away all the laws of the universe in order to believe this one thing. But so here's the challenge for me, Michael. I got to know a man by the name of Francis Collins. Yeah, and so you know who Francis Collins is. He's one of the great scientists of our time. He's the guy who decoded the genome. They don't come any more brilliant than he is. He's smarter than I am. He may even be smarter than you are.
He is.
He is. He knows his way around a laboratory, and he would never go to work in his laboratory and look for a miracle to cure cancer. And if anybody proposed doing that when he was director of the NIH, he would say, no, you can't do that yet. Okay, here's the part, the bridge I can't cross that other people can, that he has crossed. I said to him one day, I was trying to work this out. I said, well, Dr. Collins, you're a Christian, but I guess that doesn't, in your case, mean you believe that Christ literally rose from the dead and those molecules magically reassemble themselves. You believe in the teachings, right? And he said, no, you can't be a Christian if you did not believe that that happened. And I believe it did. So here you have a way of thinking that somehow cordons off the miracles in one part of their reasoning in their life from their completely unaffected ability to do all the work as a scientist that you or I would do. I don't have that capacity, but I came to realize, this is where I may lose you, but tell me, that if someone has a mind that can encompass faith on the one hand and encompass scientific materialism and function in both worlds, that they're better off than I am because they have answers to both kinds of questions. They have this abiding faith, this transcendent sense of the world. They're alive to maybe a kind of richer sort of explanation for things. That my worldview is maybe kind of two-dimensional or shallow by comparison. And I'm not saying I'm unhappy or want to be any different than I am. I'm just saying it seems like there is a way of thinking that most people are capable of that I and maybe you are not.
Yeah.
So now have I lost you?
No. Well, so this, in a way, this is similar to fideism, which is William James's idea that was embraced by Martin Gardner. I don't know if you knew Martin, but he was, one of the founders of the modern skeptical movement, one of the founders of the other skeptic magazine, Skeptical Inquirer, along with James Randi and Paul Kurtz and Ray Hyman and the other hardcore skeptics and atheists. But he was not an atheist. He was a fideist. And his argument was that there are certain questions in life that if they cannot be answered by science and rationality, and they're important, and the two main ones are free will and determinism, and then the other one is God's existence and the afterlife. And that, science cannot tell us one way or the other for sure. I mean, the determinists have really good arguments, but so do the compatibilists and some of the free will people, and it's just, I feel like I have free will. It works better for me if I assume I do. It works better for society if we assume people are making volitional choices because we have to hold them morally accountable. You can't prove otherwise. You can have arguments, but ultimately it just comes down to sort of a pragmatic, you make the leap or not. Does it work for you? And Martin said, I believe in God and the afterlife. And of course, people like James Randi are like, what? And he's like, listen, I'm not claiming I can prove it. And I'm not trying to convince you of anything. This is just my belief, right? And so I think there is room for something like that if it works for you. Not in a condescending way. It's just, it's one of those big life questions. And, something, and then a second thought on that. Maybe these religious truths are different from empirical truths, but not just in the metaphorical sense. Maybe like there's political truths, like what's the right percentage of immigration we should allow? There's no right answer. It's not like, we're going to run an experiment and go there, 14.5% immigrants per year, whatever. There's no right answer. Or, what's the correct percentage of upper income tax bracket? Should it be 70% or 35%, or now Trump wants to lower it to like 20% or whatever? There's no right answer. It's just, what do you want? And what does the populace want? And it's just sort of a power game. Sometimes I think religion's a little bit like that, because if the resurrection was literally true, and Christians claim they have good arguments, there's massive books, here's why you should believe the resurrection happened. The empty tomb, the 3 women that went there, the post-death apparitions, to the disciples. Disciples went to their deaths believing in this, and on and on and on they go. If the arguments are so good, why don't Jews believe it? They believe in the same God as you. They believe in the same book, at least the Old Testament. And they even think there is a Messiah to come. They just don't think it was the carpenter from Nazareth. That's all. And they don't think your arguments are all that good. And to Christians, theologians, I say, you can't say that these Jewish rabbis just don't understand the arguments. Of course they do. These are smart cookies, right? I mean, they know what's going on. They just don't think the arguments are very good. So why not just to take it as like a literal truth, or like a political truth, something like that? And so there, I just think it comes down to you just make that leap or not. And you and I don't, but others do. And Francis Collins, I think, is one of those. At the end of Language of God, he talks about that experience of the frozen waterfall, where he got down on his knees and had the experience of communicating with God or Jesus. I forget what it was. But and I think some people just have powerful experiences like that, enough to move them in that direction, like Martin Gardner said, hey, look, I'm just going to believe it. In the same way, last story, Ken Miller did this on stage. I've told this story a bunch of times on this podcast, so sorry for the redundancy. But, where with Dawkins and me and Ken Miller, the microbiologist who debunked all the intelligent design creationism about the flagellum and all that stuff. And but he, at the end of his book, he says, and by the way, I'm a Catholic and I believe in Jesus as my savior. So, of course, Richard, goes for the jugular. Okay, Ken, let's say we found a piece of the true cross. And on the piece of the true cross was a little bit of flesh, and we could extract the DNA of Jesus, because he's virgin born, the whole thing. And Ken could see where Richard was going with this. And he's like, Richard, I'm not claiming I can prove any of this. I'm just a Catholic. We accept Jesus as our savior. That's it, full stop. And it was like, oh, okay. Sort of the end of the conversation, right? And so I think, and Ken Miller is a brilliant scientist. I think some people just do that and others just don't, and whatever works for you, I guess.
So do you feel like you and I miss out on something by not having this capacity for faith and living on both sides of the line?
I don't. I mean, I'll concede that some of the social, political values of Christianity versus some other worldviews maybe, but not personally. No, I don't really miss out anything. Let me just, one of them, the mortality question here. I was thinking when you were talking about that, you and I don't believe in an afterlife. And so where do we get our meaning? And so I wrote one of my Scientific American columns called Alvy's Error. Alvy is Alvy Singer, Woody Allen's character in Annie Hall. Where as a child with the flashback, he refuses to do his homework. The mother takes him to the psychiatrist. He says, why won't you do your homework? Because the universe is expanding. He's like, the universe is big. Yeah, and one day it's going to all blow up, so none of this matters. And his mother says, what's the universe got to do with it? We live in Brooklyn, and Brooklyn's not expanding. You got to go do your homework. So, I think philosophers call it a category error, right? I mean, asking what's the ultimate meaning of life if in 14 billion years the universe is dead or heat death or whatever, that's the wrong level. It matters here and now. Shelley Kagan made this great argument, philosopher. He was debating William Lane Craig, who Craig brought up Hitler in the Holocaust and said, without God in an afterlife, then Hitler got away with it, and the suffering that the Jews experienced in the Holocaust doesn't matter. And Shelley Kagan just nailed him. It doesn't matter. It matters to the Jews who were suffering and killed. It matters to them. It matters now, right now, here and now. And so that's where we find our meaning. Making the world a better place here and now, justice and right and wrong now. And anyway,
and when they press you on that and say, I'm sure you've had this conversation often, and say, so what's so good about what you call justice? How are you? What is that based on? Isn't that just your preference? Someone else has a different preference. Maybe their preference is to kill Jews. So where do you get that from? How do you answer them?
Yeah, my answer there is that you can use the principle of interchangeable perspectives. How would you feel if somebody did that to you? Are you willing to be shoveled into a gas chamber or enslaved by some other race or whatever? And of course, most people most of the time say no. This was Lincoln's argument. As I would not be a slave, I would not be a slave owner. And it's just kind of the golden rule, really, just extrapolated. And so from there, you can just say, um, not. I guess let's see. But the way to argue it would be that what's happened over the centuries is that more and more we've taken the perspective of the other and said, okay, we have like a Rawlsian model of just society, that you are blind to the conditions you're going to be born into. You don't know if you're going to be white or black or gay or straight or man or woman or poor or rich. So the law should be designed, in a veil of ignorance. Right? That's a pretty powerful argument. That's not even a century old, but that's kind of the direction we've been moving. And then I just ask people, would you rather live in North Korea or South Korea? And they go, well, of course, South Korea. Yeah, why? And they know why, because we naturally prefer freedom over slavery. We'd rather be healthy rather than diseased. We'd rather be satiated rather than starving. And, maybe there's exceptions, but the exceptions really test the rule, because the people that usually are stuck in these societies, they don't have any choice. They don't know any different, whatever. Something like that is my argument.
So that's pretty good. And so this is something, Michael, I came to very reluctantly. Pastor Tim Keller, the co-dedicatee of this book, along with Mark McIntosh, late Pastor Keller, one of the great pastors of our day, died a couple years ago, was also an inspiration into what a good Christian really can be. And we were talking about the problem of evil, theodicy, as it's called. Why would a good God create and tolerate evil and injustice and suffering of the innocent? And he said that he had taken all the arguments that he could muster as a Christian. Free will is the big one that they use, but there's, the universe, God's thinking is a mystery, and in some larger scheme of things, it's all for the best, which leads you to excuse the Holocaust, for example. Well, somehow this is all for the best. And as you say, I don't think it's all for the best for the 6 million who died. So he said, I take everything I can and I throw it in a bucket to explain why a good God would allow evil. And he says, I can only fill that bucket 2/3 of the way, maybe 3/4 on a good day. I can't fill it. At the end of the day, I come up short. And I think that the same thing is true of my efforts to explain in a foundational, fundamental way where morality comes from. So the arguments you're making are the great liberal ethicist argument. This is Kant, the categorical imperative. A principle is just if everyone can follow it. It's not just if it's only for a few people at the expense of others. And it's Rawls. It's the veil of ignorance. You don't know where you'll be born. So you need to imagine that you're born as a less fortunate member of society. And it's Hume and Adam Smith and the theory of moral sentiments, of what he called sympathy. We mean empathy, that we're wired for that. Yet at the end of the day, I get a lot of distance toward explaining my worldview. At the end of the day, those things don't justify it, because I still can't give a definitive anchored account in why it's fundamentally better to be in South Korea than North Korea. Of course, we enjoy it more. We feel more free. We prosper more. So I can make all those observations, but I can't answer questions like, in a room where you could get away with stealing something and no one could even principle ever know. This is the motivating question, of course, of Plato's Republic. Imagine you had an invisibility ring that made you completely immune to discovery and prosecution. You could do anything you want. Why would you not do it? I don't think our side can fully answer that question, as hard as we've tried. That doesn't mean that I need to believe in God in order to answer it, because I can't get across that bridge that we discussed earlier. I just don't see how it can be true that Jesus Christ really died and came back to life. So I'm stuck in this mode of incompleteness. And I experience that. I tell people it's almost like color blindness, that there are wavelengths, spiritual wavelengths that I just don't receive. And I don't feel a need for them. I'm not unhappy about it. Yet I realize that those like Francis Collins, who can work on both sides of the line and be a scientist at work and a spiritualist home, have access to more in life than I do. And when I talk to Christians, this book evolved from a lot of conversations with Christians. And I don't understand where they're coming from, but I sometimes feel like, have you ever been on a train and you've been dozing off by the window and you start awake and you see something go by through the train window and you think you know what it is, but by the time you turn around to get a better look, you've turned the corner. I feel that I have that much insight into the world that Francis occupies. Sometimes I get a glimpse of what it might be like for him. And in some ways, I think it's, from a point of view of human functioning, I think it might be better.
Yeah, maybe. I want to
Well, I got
employ
a maybe, so that's interesting.
Yeah, well, I will employ your principle of fallibilism from your previous book and admit, I don't know for sure. It could be, when 1,000 years from now, when you and I are dead and gone and in heaven, and turns out there is a God, and it's like, oh, that explains why the Holocaust happened or this bad thing happened or whatever. Now it makes sense, because that is one of the kind of the answers that some Christians give is, God works in mysterious ways. We can't explain it, something like that. Okay. All right, fine. We'll wait and see. But in the meantime, maybe we should work to make the world a better place now. Like that's why I love that passage from the Gospels where Jesus says, the kingdom of heaven is within you. People ask me, is it coming now or later, there or here? And he's whatever he says, but I'm saying the kingdom of God is within you. Like it's here, it's now. Don't wait for it. Make the world a better place now. That's that kind of social gospel that I do think religion is good for. But in terms of ultimately, we can't ultimately say it's all right that your loved one died and suffered whatever. It's all going to be made right in the next world. That is, I can see the comfort of that if you really believed it. Although religious people seem to mourn and grieve just as much as anybody. So. Maybe that's not such a sop to grief as we like to think it is. But we don't have anything to offer for that other than, well, then you better really make the best of it now, because this is all we know for sure. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there is an afterlife, but I don't live in the afterlife. Back to Avley's error. I don't live 14 billion years from now. I live now. So this is it. And you don't know for sure either, right? I mean, I tried this argument out on Christians too, that God is, for a Christian, defined as, omniscient and omnipotent. Well, one thing I know for sure is I'm not, and neither are you. So you're not God and I'm not God. So you don't know for sure that Jesus rose from the dead or that there even is a God. And then from there you can build a kernel of doubt and say, okay, maybe, but let's just work on here and now. Something like that.
Well, that's, something that's changed for me, Michael. Is I used to be the kind of atheist that wanted to talk other people out of being religious because it just didn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
And now it's the last thing I would want to do. And it's not because I think they may be right and I may be wrong. I think, for all the reasons we talked about, I can't believe the way they believe. But I do think they have access to a way of living that I wouldn't want them to be like me. And I think that distinguishes me, I hope, from people who say, well, religion is fine for those, bums out there. I'm glad they believe, but I never would. No, it's more subtle than that. I am glad now that I live in a world that is not populated with mini-me's who have no spiritual sense
That's funny.
At all.
And do you think that might be a product of age as we get older? These studies about how people get more conservative when they get older.
No, I'll tell you what it is.
Yeah.
First, it's a product of reading one of the seminal works in my life, which you alluded to, I think, which is William James's famous essay, The Will to Believe, which is mistitled. It should be The Right to Believe. And he says exactly what we're talking about earlier. He's a scientist, right? He's a working scientist. So he is not saying, in the bowdlerized, stupid, incorrect version, believe anything that makes you feel better. That is not what he's saying. He's saying that there are certain realms where science really can't reach, like free will, for example, is one of them. And in those realms where science can't reach, there is possibility of a type 1 error where you believe something that's false, like God exists, and you're wrong about that. But there's also the possibility of a type 2 error where you fail to believe something that is true. And either way, you're going to have to believe something. So he's saying in a realm that science can't resolve, people have every epistemic right to turn to religion to solve that question, because what if they fail to believe a religious truth that turns out to be true? That's just as damaging. You kind of alluded to that just now. If you die and there you are in heaven, you've made a terrible mistake by failing to believe. So that was transformational. And then the second thing that was transformational was people like Mark and some others that Pastor Keller, who I've alluded to, and living people like Pete Weiner, who's a Christian who came to it the hard way, who taught me that someone can be a believing Christian, believe in things that just seem to me superstition, yet be deeply enriched by those beliefs and not at all hampered in their rationality and their ability to function in a material world. That's when I started changing. Maybe some of it's age too, I guess. I'm just not as militant as I was.
Yeah,
and then I guess the third thing is what we've been talking about, which is the post-religious age in America is turning out to be a disaster. So there's that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think probably that's what Gould meant by his NOMA, non-overlapping magisteria, although he's been hammered pretty hard by people like Jerry Coyne and Richard Dawkins for that. But I really think him and Sagan also, Carl was very ecumenical about these things. He wrote a book, there was William James's The Varieties of Religious Experience, and Carl's posthumously published book based on a series of lectures was The Varieties of Scientific Experience. So he addresses those questions and makes arguments similar to what we're making here. By the way, Martin Gardner also pointed out, I'm not claiming that it's okay to believe Uri Geller can bend spoons if it makes you feel good. I'm not claiming the little, psychics or the astrologer who reads your star chart. I'm just talking about these handful of, he was a follower of James. So just those big questions that science came. Okay, fine. But I guess, again, where the rubber meets the road is when the Christian says, but we actually really have the right religion. Well, what about the Jews? What about the Muslim that says the same thing as you? And if I say, well, for this person, their Islamic upbringing and the Muslim religion for them, Islamic religion, works for them, and it's, it addresses these deep questions that I can't ultimately give them. Okay, fine. But a lot of Christians go further than that. They say, well, they really are making a mistake. They really should accept Jesus as their savior. Well, they don't. Why not? Well, I could work on them. I'll have them read this book about the resurrection. And to me, again, there we go back to saying you're putting it back in the empirical box of science. Like, you really should believe this in the same way you should believe climate change is real or whatever. Smoking causes cancer. It's not like that.
There's a new book coming out by Ross Douthat
I read
of the New York Times. Yeah. You've probably heard of this. Maybe I'd love to hear him on your show because
he's
you
coming
would have.
On. Yeah, he's coming on.
Yeah, I can't wait for that. So he's got an answer to this, which I don't really find persuasive, but it's interesting. His book is called Believe, Why Everyone Should Be Religious. And it's very different from my book because, of course, I'm not a believer, and I don't think everyone has to be religious. But I do think people who are religious, who are Christian, should follow Christian doctrine instead of the great church of MAGA or woke. But his answer to this is, the particulars of the religion that you follow don't matter as much as the general ethical direction that they take, and that they converge, the great religious traditions, on some important points. And they build on each other. And one of them you alluded to earlier, it's the Golden Rule, which we have versions of in Judaism and Christianity. So he's saying, what we're saying here is not that all the specifics of one religion are true and all the others are false. It's that the larger framework, the larger ethics that they're getting at, things like the fundamental dignity of human beings made in the image of God, for example. So pick your religion, he says. I don't care. Actually, I'd like you to be a Christian, but I don't care really if you're not. But be something, is what he says.
Yeah. I think he's a Catholic now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, fine. But there I would say religions have been at this for thousands of years, and they have correctly figured out the nature of human nature, that we have inner demons and better angels. So we need some kind of structure over society. And government's one of them, but religion's the other one. There's an eye in the sky watching you. You're not getting away with it. You think you get away with it, but there's an eye in the sky. But even more than that, and by the way, in response to that argument, I would say, but you did it. Even if nobody else knows, and that can change the way you perceive yourself. I am the kind of person who would steal something. That's not good. I mean, this is Aristotle's virtue ethics, right? You should act virtuous, and then you'll actually be virtuous. You'll actually inculcate the feelings correctly. This is a good thing to do, and I feel it now. In other words, it's not enough to fake being a good person, like a psychopath maybe would. They know what they're supposed to say and do to make other people think that they're virtuous and moral and altruistic, when actually they're just free riders and manipulating them. No, because we've evolved. This is Bob Triver's argument about deception and self-deception, that we've evolved some kind of sensitivity to other people trying to exploit us and lie to us and cheat. And so we kind of look for facial cues and nonverbal cues and so on. And so the real good, so his argument for self-deception is that you won't give off those cues of lying and so on if you actually believe it, really believe whatever it is that you're arguing. So to me, I think like a lot of cult leaders or whatever, they really believe what they're saying, David Koresh and these kind of people. They may have started off just bullshitting their followers, but, then they got better at it, the more they really believed in what they were saying. So I think that goes a long way to explaining some of these movements. But I want to ask you about back to the rise of the religious right in the 80s and now how it's different now.
Oh, yeah, right.
It seemed like that kind of influence on politics was because these are the kind of virtues we really believe in, and we think it would be good for society if other people believed in them, and we got the kind of political policies like abortion or whatever, that would bolster our religious beliefs. And Reagan went along with some of that, and so on. But it seems different now, So maybe if you want to explain, kind of reflect on that for a moment, and then explain 80% of evangelicals voted for Trump in 2016. Wow. I mean, why? That's just astonishing.
Yeah, it's solid 80%. So the story that my book recounts in a word is secularization, meaning secularization not just of a larger society, but of Christianity in America. And the first wave of that, which I don't get into because there's, a whole library of books on it, is the decline of the mainline Protestant churches. That's the United Methodists and the Episcopal Church and so forth. And that happens in the latter half of the 20th century. And sociologists say that happens because the church loses its cultural distinctiveness. It stops being countercultural and it becomes a consumer choice and just blends in. And people drift away because it's not satisfying their spiritual needs. That leaves, the story becomes in the latter half of the 20th century, the evangelical churches are growing. They are prospering. They are more countercultural. They are rooted in scripture. They are giving people a contrasting way of life. So that church, starting in the 80s under Reagan and then accelerating, gets into bed with Republican partisan politics. And that happens initially from the top down. That's Falwell, Jerry Falwell, and Pat Robertson, and folks like that. And they're saying, look, our values are under attack, and we need to form a political coalition. And they make a bet that they can influence partisan politics more than partisan politics will influence Christianity. And for a while, that seems to be working for them. But then it accelerates. And now we're in a second wave of secularization, which I alluded to earlier. In the second wave, it's not coming mostly from the top down. It's not major Christian figures saying, let's be Christian nationalists, let's be dominionists, let's take over the country, let's bring politics into the church. The pastors generally hate this stuff. And a lot of them are quitting because of it. The last thing they want is to give a sermon about Jesus Christ, which is what they want to talk about, and come in on Monday morning to an email inbox overflowing with radicalized, politicized church members telling them that they're going all squishy in the culture wars. So the second wave is coming from the bottom up. It's coming from the pews. The pastors use, it's become a cliche, but they say it's true, that we get them for an hour or two every week if we're lucky. Cable TV, cable news gets them for 12 hours a week. So the people are coming to church saying, we are here to pursue the culture wars. And that's a change in the complexion of the church, and that's proceeded quite rapidly. It goes to the next level with support for Donald Trump. That's initially kind of reluctant. They're really not sure about Trump. He doesn't look like that noble of a character. But in a very short time, they fall in love with Trump. And the white evangelical Protestant church becomes far and away his most devoted constituency. It's not like they're tolerating him until someone better comes along. They, in the words of Christians like Russell Moore, they more or less idolize him. And that's a change. That is a deeper kind of politicization than we've seen before. Trump offers power. That's what he says in 2016. It's what he says again in 24. He's very open about this. He says, if you vote for me, if I get in, you will have power. He also promises retribution. Retribution is not part of the gospel of Jesus Christ, as you're probably aware. Yeah. He offers, we're going to get into the trenches and win the cultural wars and make liberals drink tears. Again, not very Christ-like. So Christians, not me, but Christians, a lot of Christians look at this and say, this is not even really Christianity at all. This is a paganization of the church. And as Russell Moore says, wonderful quote, I just love this. He says, when asked why young people are leaving the church in droves, he says, if all we offer them is a choice between paganization and secularization, it shouldn't surprise us if they take one or the other.
Right. Yeah, sociologist religion makes a distinction between people's differing versions of God as this kind of Old Testament strong, draconian, punishing God, and the God of the New Testament, the more kind of feminized, loving, altruistic, giving, caring. I wonder if Trump is tapping into more Old Testament versions of God.
Yeah, there's a wonderful book about this called Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen Kobus Dumez. Yeah, you'd want to have her on the show if you can get her, but she argues that part of what's happened, of course, it's not the whole story, and these things are always multi-causal, but part of what happened is that people imported into the church these role models about masculinity, that you have to be strong and dominant, you have to be a winner, and that those became values that supplanted the values of Jesus. So yeah, she goes there. She talks about masculinity, but all of these stories have in common that it's the church secularizing, absorbing the politicized culture around it and taking on those colors and ceasing to be the radically countercultural vision of Jesus Christ himself, who is not interested in power in this world. He was interested in orienting his followers to prepare for the next world by doing right in this world. And he would not be impressed by the idea. So Jesus, why don't you guys take over the Roman Empire? Or Pilate says, we'll give you power if you just shut up. I don't think he takes that deal.
No. That's really funny. Yeah, it reminds me a little bit. I had Chris Rufo on the show, and I made it kind of similar to the USC debate conference we were at on what to do about wokeness in academia. And, one line is that, well, we should fight it from within. We handful of professors should stand up and say, no more of these loyalty statements and DEI training programs. And we're going to try to fight the battle of ideas from the bottom up. And Chris Rufo's answer to that is, you guys tried that and you lost. It's over. It's time for us to come in from the top down, and we're going to kick some ass by passing laws. And of course, they love now Trump is doing this. And it kind of reminds me a little bit of that. Maybe these kind of Christians, that mega Christians, let's call them, maybe are saying to the other Christians, we tried that. We lost the culture wars. The libtards won. They won in academia, they won in Hollywood, and now they're trying to win in politics, and we're not going to put up with it anymore. And that's our guy.
There's a famous speech that Donald Trump Jr. gave to Turning Point USA. I use a clip from this in my book talk. And you really need to hear him do it. It's way better than I could possibly summarize. But he comes right out and says, I understand the turn the other cheek idea. I get it. But we have tried that, and it didn't work. We need to understand that we've got to put that away, and basically he says fight back. He puts it so much better. I should find it and read it to you.
Maybe we'll splice it in here for the show, because I saw that.
That would be great.
I watched your talk at the LDS church, in which you showed that clip. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah. I'll send you the clip if you want. I've got the MP4 file.
That's what. Yeah, go ahead.
But that's exactly what you're saying. He says, this Jesus stuff. Look how that ended. It ended bad. That guy died on a cross. For God's sake, what a loser!
Right. I like saviors who are winners.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's it's really hard to believe. Yeah. That reminds me. And I think it was 2017 or 2018. I did a God debate with Dinesh D'Souza at a Christian church in Minneapolis, and it was like 1,000 people there, all Christians. I'm like the only non-believer in the room, and this is when Trump was getting ramped up, and all the stuff was pretty fresh in people's minds about his infidelities and divorces and bankruptcies and the Hollywood Access tape, all that stuff. And basically I said, come on, how is it possible you guys support this guy? He's not a Christian. And if he is, he's fooling you. And their answer was, yeah, we know he's a deeply flawed person, but that he's going to get us the judges we want to overturn Roe v. Wade. And that's one of our big things. And this was Dinesh's big thing, that he finally, some Republican is finally doing something about Roe. They all say they're going to do it, and they never do anything. Trump's doing it, and he did. So that's a good example.
Yeah, that may be the most credible argument for a Christian to support Trump, which is, he's saving the lives of children by making the appointments that he made. But as Pete Weiner points out, that gets you to, I'll accept the guy. It doesn't get you to, I will adore the guy. And choose him over all other available Republicans, any one of whom would nominate the same judges and do many of the same policies without the cruelty, without the kids in cages. They had those choices. They had that choice in 2024 in the form of Governor Haley. So
Right. Or Ted Cruz in 2016, who's a real Christian. I mean, he's the real deal, right?
yeah, that's right. And in 2016, you could see it because Trump, had not tried to mount a coup against the Constitution. But by 2024, people know what the guy's all about and they have alternatives. I wrote an article about this, Michael, that Vice President Pence was in the 2024 race.
Right.
Now, this is someone who is in the Trump administration. He's a true believer on abortion, which Trump obviously is not. He pretty much threw abortion under the bus in order to get elected this time. He said, let the states handle it and I'll veto an abortion ban if it reaches me. I'll let those babies die in all those states. Pence didn't do that. He's the real deal. And he was summarily and totally rejected. He didn't even get a hearing from evangelicals. So, that tells you something, I think.
And what is it?
I think they're in love with Donald Trump.
Yeah.
I think there's something about his ethos of retribution and squashing the other side that is superseding the gospel that they say they believe in. And as Moore and others point out, Moore says that young people he talks to are not leaving the church because of its doctrines or because they don't believe the church's doctrines. They're leaving the church because they don't think the church believes the church's doctrines.
How far would you go with someone like Bill Maher, who argues that one of the reasons the Dems lost is because of the crazy far left progressive wokeness, and that Trump and the GOP, the new GOP, at least they're standing up to that?
It's a factor. I don't think it swung the race. We could have a separate conversation about 2024. I think the Dems should move to the center and get rid of what I call genderqueer, transqueer ideology, just because it's wrong. It's incorrect. I think it's harmful, not just politically harmful, but I think it's bad for people to uphold ideas that are scientifically wrong. But I don't think any of that explains why 80+% of evangelicals not only vote for Trump, but love Trump. There is one religious group in America, and only one of whom of a majority, 61%, agree to the proposition that illegal aliens, illegal immigrants, are poisoning the blood of our country. That's a new polling question. Until last year, no one even asked it because it never occurred to anyone to ask Americans, do you believe immigrants are poisoning the blood of our country? One group, 60% agrees, and that's white evangelical Protestants. And by the way, Republicans, exactly the same.
Wow. And they actually use that language, poisoning the blood of society. Yeah. I mean, that's very kind of.
They thought when they tested it, they were going to maybe, 5%, 10%. Yeah. They were shocked and horrified when the numbers came back. 60% of evangelicals said that.
Wow. I mean, that's that tapping into that blood and soil romantic movement that the Nazis kind of inculcated, right? The Jews are poisoning our society. Yeah. Yeah, that's disturbing. Well, I guess what I'm getting at behind that is back to this, what's sometimes called the replacement theory. That is, with the decline of religion and the rise of the nuns, there's something like a God-shaped hole that needs to be filled, not necessarily with God, but some sort of religion-like structure. So wokeism or progressivism, or like John Mortar's the whole anti-racism, Ibram X. Kendi, and all that is fulfilling that role of religion. They have original sin. We're all born racist, and you don't have to atone for it, and all that kind of stuff. How far do you go along that line?
I believe in the God-shaped hole. I think that's true. If you've seen the statistics on things like loneliness and social isolation, Surgeon General put out a report on that in 2023. And in exactly the same period where you see religion collapsing, you see increases in all of those numbers, and sociologists can read you chapter and verse, and I'm sure have, on it turns out religion, organized religion, institutional religion, it's not enough to sit at home on your sofa and practice your faith. You do it with people. It builds community and connection. And it's, where you meet people who may be like yourself, sometimes even a spouse. And it gives you a sense of a ritual oriented to something higher and all of that. So I think there is a God-shaped hole. I don't think it's the only thing going on. There's a lot more going on. There's the epistemic collapse of truth, and there's cell phones, and there's overparenting and all the stuff Jonathan Haidt talks about. But yeah, I think religion is a factor. And I want to say, if I could just come to this, because I think it's a core message of what I'm trying to do with this book. It's not just the generic collapse of faith. This book is called Cross Purposes, Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. It is specifically about Christianity addressed to Christians. And that's partly because if you're worried about the social and governing crisis in America, you hunt where the ducks are in Christianity. White Protestantism is still the predominant faith, and that's where the crisis is. I'd like to say Jews are important enough to drive a national crisis, but we're not. But there's a deeper cause, which is that Christianity's core principles, the three things that theologians say Christianity stands for fundamentally that distinguish it, turn out to be very similar to the things that underlie Madisonian constitutional pluralism, our system. That's the founders understood this thing. And in Christianity, those three things are, number one, don't be afraid. Don't approach life in a posture of fear. Have faith. Number two, imitate Jesus. Be like him. And number three, forgive each other. No talk of retribution. That's not what this is about. Those things map onto what the founders called Republican virtues, the things that they needed to inculcate to make the Constitution work. Don't be afraid means be willing to lose an election. It's not the end of the world. Don't panic. Don't approach the system with fear. Approach it with a sense of trust. Number two, be like Jesus. Jesus is fundamentally egalitarian. The least of these is who he's talking about. Liberalism, in the sense I mean constitutional liberalism, is judged by does it protect minorities? That's in the Constitution. Jesus also believes in the equal dignity of every person. That's Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal and endowed by their creators. So that's core. And then finally, forgive each other. That maps onto sometimes you're going to win an election. Don't engage in retribution. Engage in forbearance. You're going to have to share the country and treat the other team the way you want them to treat you when they're in power, because someday that's going to happen. So Jesus is like James Madison, not like MAGA. And that's the core of my message in this book, is I come along as an outsider and I say, I'm not suggesting that Christians become more liberal or conservative or democratic or Republican or secular. I'm just saying it's all right here in the teachings of Jesus Christ himself. If the church will elevate those elements of its own theology that support our democratic process, it will strengthen our country and it will also strengthen the church. So, call me presumptuous, Michael, but why not give Jesus a try?
You should return to that bumper sticker. What would Jesus say, or what would Jesus do? That was it. Yeah, that's your core message. Well, I love that message. Of course, that's a far more uplifting message. How do you get to the Mormon Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints?
Oh boy, was that ever a surprise? Did that surprise you?
Yeah, totally. Because I want to read you something here, because this was from my 2015 book, The Moral Arcs. I wrote that in 2014. I think these quotes come from 2013 or so. The face of sin today often wears the mask of tolerance, said Thomas S. Monson, current president of the Latter-day Saints Mormon Church, who continued by saying, "Do not be deceived. Behind that facade is heartache, unhappiness, and pain." Refusing to wear the mask of tolerance might explain why, in my own liberal state of California, the Mormon Church, in league with the Catholic and other groups, poured $22 million into the campaign to uphold Proposition 8, a constitutional amendment prohibiting same-sex marriage. Quote, some portray legalization of so-called same-sex marriage as a civil right, said Gordon B. Hinckley, late president of the LDS Church. This is not a matter of civil rights, it's a matter of morality. It's odd that Hinckley understood civil rights as somehow distinct from morality, as if morality isn't the bedrock of all rights. And odd, too, that although tax-exempt organizations are not allowed to participate in political campaigns, Mormons took over virtually every aspect of Proposition 8. Anyway, you see where I'm going with this. That's, they would not have supported what you are now. You're gay married. They would. What happened to that church? And
Well, believe me, they still do not support it. Homosexuality is a sin in their doctrine. They are theologically, socially very conservative. And being openly involved in a same-sex marriage can get you excommunicated in their church. So something interesting happened over there.
Yeah.
So there's a political story and then there's a theological story. And they're both interesting and they converge. Which one would you like? Or do you want them both?
Well, I'm going to just say parenthetically, watching your book talk to the LDS Church, wherever that was in Utah, in Salt Lake City, maybe. Anyway, they could not have been nicer and more respectful of you. I thought, wow, okay, maybe they've had a big change of heart here since 2015 when the Supreme Court, ruled on same-sex marriage. Maybe they've all just changed.
Oh, it's way more interesting than that.
Okay, yeah,
they're doing something way more radical than a change of heart about same-sex marriage.
Okay,
something so countercultural that to me it's a little bit breathtaking.
Okay, go for it.
All right. So I'll give you the brief political history, but then I'll explain why it's breathtaking. In 2008, the church went all in to oppose same-sex marriage in California. And they won that, but at the cost of a huge backlash and a ton of criticism. And they looked around and said, is this really what we want to be doing? And so a year or two later, they came out in support of an LGBT anti-discrimination statute in Salt Lake City, where their headquarters is, because they said, well, we're against same-sex marriage, but why would we want someone to lose their job because they're gay? That makes no sense. So that raised some eyebrows, and then a whole lot more eyebrows went up in 2015 when the church struck a compromise with the LGBT community to pass a statewide anti-discrimination ordinance that included religious carve-outs for churches. So, Brigham Young University does not have to include married same-sex couples in their married student housing, things like that. Nothing that guts the bill. Huge advance for LGBT people in the state, and not just legally, but culturally. They're much more accepted now than they were as a result of that. So that really got my attention because, believe me, that is not what evangelicals and the Conference of Bishops, that's the Catholics, are doing. In 2022, they blow me completely away by helping push through the Respect for Marriage Act, which enacts same-sex marriage in federal statute in case the Supreme Court ever pulls back on it. Again, bundled together with some important new religious liberty protections that say we'll never use federal money or federal law to try to impose same-sex marriage on any church, which is a big deal, and every Democrat agrees to that. It says no more weaponizing the government. That really got my attention. They oppose my marriage. Yet they put it in federal law. The evangelical world and the Conference of Bishops going, what the heck are you doing? Why would you pass a law enshrining the very thing that you believe is sinful? Okay, switch tracks to the theological. I won't get into the weeds, but their doctrine has an idea of agency. It's a lot like free will, but with a difference. Free will says that every individual has the capacity to make moral choices. Agency takes it a step further and says, we need to not only have the capacity to make moral choices, we need to have the opportunity. which means we need to be presented with wrong choices as well as right choices. If we don't have to actually steer, we will not develop morally in a way that brings us closer to God. That concept leads straight to pluralism, which is, I have my views about right and wrong, but I'm not going to impose them on anyone else because you have to have the opportunity to choose for yourself. That translates into, okay, if we can get clear legal boundaries that allow us to continue our doctrines in our community, we will help advance pluralism outside the church so other people can live in different ways. So you hear about Christian nationalism, which wants the country to be Christian, and Christian dominionism, which says Christians should basically rule the country. This is Christian Madisonianism, Christian constitutionalism. This is saying, no, what Jesus Christ wants us to do on this planet, as their number 2 person, soon to be their number 1 person, says, is patience, negotiation, and mutual accommodation. Jesus Christ wants us to create a world in which it's possible to strike compromises that enlarge the space for different types of people and religions to get along together. And he goes further. He says that patience, negotiation, and mutual accommodation, what you and I call compromise, is not giving up on your principles. It is a principle. So I look at this, I look around the country, I don't see anything like this developed to nearly this point anywhere else. And it's not that they're just talking the talk, Michael. They're walking the walk. They're doing the work, legislating this stuff. And they're well aware it's very countercultural. I just spoke with church leaders the day before I got to Brigham Young University to give my talk. The whole campus, 20,000+ students, gathered to hear Elder Stevenson talk about their mission of peacemaking, by which they mean deconflicting, expanding the space for civil disagreement and political pluralism. And I'm like, okay, this is not changing their mind on same-sex marriage or homosexuality. This is saying you can be a true believer and yet not want to run the whole country the way you would run your church. And I wrote this book partly because so many of us have so much to learn from that.
Mm. Oh, indeed. Amazing. Yeah. Do we know how Mormons voted in 2016 and 2024? 2020 for that matter?
Yeah, they voted majority Trump, but I don't, I should have that number at the top of my head. But I believe it was in the 60s and not the 80s. Mm. They were, in terms of their politics, they were kind of in lockstep with Republicans until, this is according to data that Ryan Burge, a religious demographer, collected. And they shifted away from Republicans to some extent, not, overwhelmingly. They didn't switch sides, but they shifted away from Republicans in 2016 and 2017. And what happened about them? And some of the leading voices of conscience against the real abuses of MAGA have been Latter-day Saints.
Well, Mitt Romney,
Rusty Bowers. These are heroes.
Right. And look what happened to them. Cheney run out of town.
Yeah, well, Rusty Bauer lost his seat in the state legislature, and was, I think, sanctioned in a bad way by the state party in Arizona. He's a guy he was the Speaker of the House in Arizona, and Rudy Giuliani called him up on behalf of the president and said, the election was stolen, and I want you to call a special session and start an investigation and pass a resolution that will put forward, I think it was an alternative slate of electors. And Rusty Bauer said, send me the evidence that the election was stolen. And he received no evidence. And so he blocked that move in an overwhelmingly Republican legislature. And he was never forgiven for that. So he's lost his career in politics. But I interviewed him for the book. And guess what he said? He said he believed in the doctrine of agency. And that he just wasn't going to do it.
You think the GOP will ever get back to the the days of Mitt Romney and John McCain and Reagan, let's say, or Bush, or is the future going to be more MAGA?
Short term, it's more MAGA. I mean, isn't it? They just won a famous victory.
But I mean, like in 28, let's say J.D. Vance runs.
Well, 2028, so this is a whole different subject, politics. There's a dispute about how to read the 2024 election. And one of the ways it's read is a big mandate for Trump and a realignment to MAGA. And that's not how I see it. I'm with those who say, actually, it was a quite ordinary election featuring two extraordinary candidates for different reasons. But it's the third election in a row where the voters turned out the incumbent party.
Mm.
And that's happened. That happened everywhere in the world in 2024. Incumbents were turned out everywhere. If you compare the exit polls of 2024 to 2020, it looks like a big shift toward Trump. Try comparing the exit polls 2024 to 2016, the last time Trump ran against an incumbent, an unpopular, essentially incumbent party candidate. Almost identical. The only exception is a continuing realignment of Hispanics toward bipartisanship. That's been going on for years. That's healthy. That's a natural diversification. Other than that, 2024 was a rerun of 2016. The only state that changed was Nevada. And if that pattern holds, what we're learning is that Western publics are becoming ungovernable. They hate whoever's in office, and they always turn them out. And that suggests that in 2028, the Republicans will lose because they're the incumbent.
Amazing. I hadn't heard that.
Well,
that's great. Very interesting. Yes.
I'll send you a link to a short piece if you want to put it in the show notes.
Yeah, I'll do that. No, that's great. Yeah, okay.
But that's not a fix for our bad situation.
No,
you don't want to live in a world where it's impossible to make the public happy and they keep turning out incumbents and electing worse and worse people along the way. That is not a good thing.
Right. No. Yeah, you described James Madison as like an alien. I have to agree with you. You know, during COVID, when I had extra time, I went and actually read the Federalist Papers. I didn't read them. I downloaded the audio version while I was out and about doing my thing, listening to them. And it is truly astonishing. These are like from another world. Where did this come from? Madison is the main character there. Just go ahead and riff on the founding fathers of Madison.
Well,
wow.
It said there is no Madison memorial or monument in Washington. And it said, if you want to see James Madison's monument, look around. He's the greatest political genius who ever lived. And it's either alien intervention or an act of God, if you believe in God, that he appeared at the moment he did. But he's the guy who has the great insight of how to make a large democracy stable and dynamic over time. No earlier democracy had ever succeeded in that. And what's the secret? So Madison he's still a young guy in the constitutional era. He's in his 30s. He finds all the books that he can on democracy, and he concludes that there are two things that kill democracy. And the first is ambition, and the second is faction. By ambition, he means populist demagogues who get elected making big promises and then undermine the system. Does that sound familiar? And all the founders feared that. They were well aware of that. Hamilton warns about it very explicitly. And the second is faction, by which he means what we call special interests. And those can be groups that either, in a small democracy, they take over and push out the other groups and basically become coercive. Or in a larger democracy, they split the country up in so many different ways that it can't govern and falls apart, becomes a rabble. How do you solve those problems? What one force can counteract the power of ambition? And here is where this is so breathtakingly brilliant and counterintuitive. There's only one force that can contain ambition, and that's ambition itself. So you create a system in which you force people to compromise in order to get anything done, and that means that my ambition and your ambition have to find a way to work together. And out of that process of compromise is not splitting babies, cutting everything in half and leaving people unsatisfied. He understands compromise as a creative, dynamic, innovative process that forces the two of us to bring in third parties, new ideas. Hey, wait a minute. What if we went to these guys and they did this, and expand the decision space? Factions, same thing. He says, what do you do about faction? You expand the sphere. You make the republic so big that no one faction can take over, and then you force the factions to compete and compromise. They too become a dynamic engine. And lo and behold, this works for the last 250 years and can keep working. So, yeah, space alien.
Here's my favorite quote from Madison, Federalist Paper number 51. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself.
I know. Isn't that great?
Yeah.
Madison was not quotable. He's not a great writer. So he's not as famous as Jefferson, who, everything he says is pithy. But that is one of Madison's great ones.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of the Federalist Papers, there's like paragraph long sentences. Therefore, furthermore, and moreover, like, oh my God, where am I again on this in this thought? I mean, they were really smart, deeply read people.
Well, I'm a member of the Church of Madison. I hope that's clear. And
yes.
But that's why, I wrote this book because, as I say, Jesus Christ he's like James Madison, not like MAGA.
Yeah. You want to say a parting message to your friend Mark as we wrap up?
Well, I always I have trouble getting through this without choking up.
Yeah, it's a beautiful passage.
Well, a big compliment for the book is it's a very short book. It's part of a series of short books. So I had 40,000 words and I squeezed it in. I cheated a bit with the bibliographical note, but people read it and they say they're surprised to get to the end and shed a tear.
Yeah, I did.
This book is my apology to Mark for the dumb, atheistic, militant things that I said. When I met him, I was the kind of atheist that wanted to talk him out of being religious and that did not see the good that Christianity can do at its best. And Mark died of ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, in 2001. He was 61 years old. He was very young. And he said ruefully that he had gone through the catalog of things you can die of and concluded that ALS was probably the worst. But he did not lose his faith. And the one thing that he most wanted was he was paralyzed from the neck down. He was intubated. He could breathe with assistance from a tube, and he could still swallow somewhat enough to get nourishment. But he knew that he would, in due course, lose the ability to talk and communicate. And it was already a struggle for him. And he said he did not want to live through that, being locked in. And I went to see him in 2001 and 2021, excuse me. And he expressed this, and then a couple months later, after lunch, he retired to read a book. He could still do that with help, and died quietly. So at least he got that wish.
Yeah.
He never cursed God. I don't know why he didn't, how he didn't. God sent him this terrible disease, but he never did.
Yeah. Wow. That's a moving story, Jonathan. Thank you for writing your book. Thanks for telling that story. Thanks for coming on to talk to me about all this stuff. Really great conversation. The book is, again, Cross Purposes, Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. It's a beautifully written book. Great storyteller. You're such a great writer. Such a good thinker. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Michael.